Okay, so there we go. All right, wonderful. So our agenda today is really is rather straightforward. As I said, we're going to be hearing from Pat de Bruin from Amnesty International about Amnesty's new report. I'll introduce Pat for a second. He's going to give us a little bit of background in terms of the situation of the Rohingya. He is going to also talk to us about, in particular, Meta's role in human rights abuses against the Rohingya, and talk to us about some of the expectations under international business and human rights frameworks that we have of Meta, as well as the report's recommendations, in particular with regard to Meta's responsibility to provide remedy for victims of abuses. Then we're going to turn things over to Simon Billamas, and Simon is going to talk to us in particular from an investor perspective in terms of the types of expectations that investors would have of Meta, and also talk to us about plans that are underway for developing an investor statement. So let me just briefly introduce our two speakers. So first, Pat de Bruin is a researcher and advisor on technology and human rights with Amnesty International. His work focuses on the human rights impacts of predominantly data-driven business models in the tech sector. His current research agenda seeks to examine the relationship between social media algorithms and real-world violence, with a particular emphasis on conflict-affected settings. His most recent work, which we're about to hear about today, investigates the role of Meta, or of course formerly Facebook, in relation to the mass violence perpetrated against the Rohingya people of Myanmar in 2017, leading to the publication of the new report, which was shared out in the invitation, entitled "The Social Atrocity: Meta and the Right to Remedy for the Rohingya." As I said, Simon will be then following. Simon is a board member and executive director of the International Campaign for the Rohingya. And I think actually many of you probably know Simon. He has been for over 30 years a pioneer in organizing shareholder engagement with companies in Myanmar in his roles at Trillium Asset Management, the AFL-CIO, and now at the International Campaign for the Rohingya. But Simon has overall 30 years of experience in helping unions, investors, nonprofits, universities, and communities use their power to lobby their governments and hold corporations accountable to standards of human rights, environmental responsibility, and social justice. So thank you both, Pat and Simon, for being here today. We have about, I'd say, 30 minutes. We're going to hear from both of them, and then we have about 30 minutes left, or now about 25 minutes left for Q&A, for discussion. And I'm going to share my screen here and hand it over to you, Pat, to speak to us today about the recent Amnesty report. Okay, and just a reminder, folks, if you're not speaking, since this is a meeting versus a webinar, please be sure to put yourselves on mute. Thank you, Pat.
Thank you, Rebecca. And yeah, thanks to everyone for joining. It's really, really encouraging to see so much interest in this topic. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion and the the space we have to dive a little deeper later once we get through this presentation. So right, excuse me, I'm gonna, oh yeah, there we go. The presentation just took over my whole screen, but I'm back. So yeah, can everyone see the slides that are now being shared, hopefully?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so just a brief introduction, it's already been said, but just to add to Rebecca's intro, my work with Amnesty is within the Amnesty Tech program, and it specifically focuses on the role of big tech companies in the world and their impact on human rights. And this particular issue, I mean, I'm really I'm glad it's got so much attention, because as far as we're concerned, this is really one of the most significant human rights harms associated with big tech's business practices, and this is really the first time we've been able to conduct such a deep dive into how big tech's business model and business practices is impacting human rights on such a scale and to such a severe extent. So before I delve into the detail of that investigation, I want to briefly go back to the underlying human rights violations which occurred in 2017 and which formed a key basis of this research. As many of us will recall, this was really one of the worst human rights crises in recent memory over 700,000 Rohingya were displaced in a brutal campaign of ethnic cleansing. And almost none of them have ever been able to return to their homes in Rakhine State. And most of them remain in really squalid conditions in refugee camps in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh to this day. And of course, in the process, thousands of Rohingya were killed. Many were raped and faced sexual violence. And entire villages were razed to the ground, never to be seen again. I want to emphasize the fact that this is an ongoing crisis, although the underlying, causation of this mass exodus of people was in 2017. For the communities that we interviewed, this is clearly still an ongoing crisis. Their living conditions, for the most part, in the camps are incredibly difficult. They're really denied opportunities to exercise their basic rights, including the right to education. And they have, they told us that they have very little hope for the future because of those violations. And I think thinking this through and the responsibility of Meta in particular, it's important to bear that in mind, that this is not just a historic crisis, this is an ongoing live situation for those affected communities. So the reason that we looked into this as Amnesty Tech is the prominent role played by Meta, Facebook in these atrocities. And it's worth bearing in mind that a UN investigation by the fact-finding mission for Myanmar in 2018 itself found that the role of Facebook was significant in these violations. And at the time, the IIMM called for an independent investigation into the connection between Facebook posts and business practices and real-world violence. And really, it's only now, with the benefit of newly available evidence and about 5 years later, that we've been able to conduct this investigation and take up this call that the UN fact-finding mission made back in 2018. And this is the first of its kind deep dive into the specific role, the nature and extent that Facebook played in these atrocities. And we're asking, the question was, to what extent was that a material contribution to these harms? And what does that mean for the company's responsibility under international human rights law and standards? And as part of this investigation, we were applying international business and human rights standards. And with those in mind, the key question is, did Meta reach the threshold of contribution and a substantial contribution to these harms, which is a reasonably high threshold and a very specific formula that exists under international business and human rights standards. But we felt, based on the availability of newly available and compelling evidence that enabled us to really look under the hood of how Facebook's business and its algorithms work, that this was a question worth re-examining. So going back to that time, our investigation covered the period from 2012 onwards, because that's when Meta first entered the Myanmar market, as it was Facebook at the time. And we documented really, sorry, I see that the screen hasn't been shared, but if we could go to the next slide, actually, that would be great.
Sorry, Pat, I was having problems leaving the slide forward, so I'll go ahead and try that again, just a second.
No problem. I'll continue anyway. At the time, we've documented in the report how Facebook really engaged in quite an aggressive market entry into Myanmar, and quickly became an incredibly dominant force. And it's worth repeating, although it has been said many times, Facebook really was the internet in Myanmar, and to the extent that it was the main news source for anyone with internet access. It was the main communications platform. It was the main search engine, and really was considered to be the internet for almost anyone using the internet at the time. Now, we've documented how Facebook entered that market, a very fragile context that should be considered a conflict affected setting under international standards, with little to no appropriate due diligence, and really expanded as quickly and as rapidly as it could. And in the years that followed, between 2012 and 2017, we saw Facebook becoming an echo chamber of anti-Rohingya hate that was originated by some actors linked to the state. So there were systematic operations by the Myanmar military and some of their allies, among them extremist Buddhist nationalist groups, who did systematically flood the platform with anti-Rohingya hatred, incitement to violence, and incitement to genocide over a long period. Now, we've interviewed multiple, we've interviewed many Rohingya survivors who were inside Rakhine State at the time. And we've also interviewed a lot of activists who were involved in seeking action from Facebook at the time. We've documented 15 attempts by respected activists, among them academics and local civil society actors who made very high-level interventions with Meta between 2012 and 2017, seeking urgent action and specifically warning that if Meta did not act to mitigate some of these risks, that it risked becoming the next Radio Rwanda, that it could end up ultimately contributing to mass violence or genocide in the country. Now, in addition to that, many Rohingya survivors themselves told us that they tried to use Facebook's report function. Some of them tried hundreds of times to report hundreds of different pieces of hate speech directed against them on the platform, but consistently they were told this did not violate community standards. And on both counts, in response to expert interventions, high-level interventions, and in response to individuals, affected communities using the tools that Facebook provided to report hate speech, these fell on deaf ears, and there was little to no mitigation or effective response to these measures. At the time, we now know that hate speech was spreading to such an extent that the outbreak of violence was becoming increasingly likely. Now, much of what I've just outlined has been known in general terms, but in this case, we have documented it extensively and beyond what was previously published. But I really want to focus our attention today on the role of algorithmic amplification of hate speech and incitement to violence against the Rohingya. So after the violent reckoning that occurred in 2017, Facebook was the subject of significant international criticism, including by the UN. And to an extent, it was pressured into acknowledging that it played a role. Yeah, maybe the next slide, please, Rebecca. In this violence. Now, Meta has been very successful at promoting a narrative whereby it did not do enough in the face of this unprecedented crisis, and it wants to be seen as having held its hand up. But ultimately, this narrative seeks to portray Meta as a neutral actor in this conflict. And the key takeaway from this investigation that we've been able to deep dive into how the Facebook's core technologies have actually functioned is that Facebook was far from a neutral actor in this conflict. Facebook was an active promoter of anti-Rohingya hate speech and incitement to violence, and therefore has much more significant under international human rights law and standards. Now,
sorry, Pat, don't interrupt. Just folks, if you could please remember to go on mute if you're not speaking, that'd be great. Sorry, Pat, go ahead.
Thanks, Rebecca. So the key evidence base that we've been able to rely upon in undertaking this investigation and looking specifically into the role of Facebook's algorithms in the context of the spread of hate speech is the Facebook papers. As many of us will know, last October, the whistleblower Frances Haugen disclosed a huge cache of internal Meta documents and evidence about the internal operations of the company to the US Congress, which have been since reported quite widely. Now, we've been able to access a lot of that evidence and conducted an in-depth human rights analysis and asked, what does this mean for the company's contribution to human rights harms perpetrated against the Rohingya? And the evidence coming from that is is quite shocking, and it enables much more far-reaching conclusions and understandings about the nature of the company's contribution to the harms against the Rohingya, but also the threat that the company's business model is posing to at-risk communities all across the world. And that's what I'd like to focus on now. So maybe we can go to the next slide, please, Rebecca.
I'm having some slide issues. So
No
apologies.
problem.
I keep stop sharing and sharing again. I'm not sure what's going on, but
That's
go ahead. I'll find the
okay.
next one. Go ahead. I'll just stop sharing and reshare.
Now, we could speak at great length about how these algorithms work, but I really just want the key takeaways to be understood before I continue. So the Facebook papers have taught us that nothing about the Facebook platform is neutral. The entire platform is optimized to maximize user engagement, because there's a direct correlation between how engaged users are and how much profit Meta makes. And optimizing its software, its algorithms for maximum engagement has made Facebook one of the most profitable companies of all time. However, we now know, because largely of the Facebook papers, that this optimization for maximum engagement has also resulted in the proliferation and prioritization of hate speech, incitement to violence, and disinformation. And in the case of the Rohingya, it played a substantial role in the violent reckoning which occurred. So so I wanted to cite this one example. So this actually comes from 2020, from the Facebook papers file from 2020, but it really reflects and gives a good idea of the extent really to which these algorithms have contributed to violence and incitement to violence. Because I really think it's important that we all appreciate the gravity of this impact, that this is not just a minor influence that some posts are being recommended by Facebook. Because in this one example, a video featuring the leading anti-Rohingya hate figure, Ratu, who was an extremist monk inciting violence against the Rohingya. A video of him inciting violence against the Rohingya in 2020 was the subject of an internal Facebook investigation. And this was revealed through the Facebook papers, and it revealed that 70% of the views of that video had come from chaining. And that means that Facebook's algorithms were automatically playing it for people rather than it being people choosing to watch it. So if we can imagine this at scale over many years, we can see that these algorithms helped to create an enabling environment for mass violence, with up to 70% of the views of some of the most harmful content actively coming from Facebook's promotion of that content directly for profit. Now, we now know that the core algorithms shaping the Facebook platform, we're talking about things like Facebook's newsfeed, its ranking feature, they're all optimized for maximum engagement. And coinciding with that, we saw really poor mitigation of human rights risks. And that includes really stunning failures of content moderation in the Myanmar context. Like I've mentioned, just incredibly consistent failures to respond to complaints. But we've also now have the tools to appreciate that content moderation, which has been vaunted by Meta as the solution to many of these harms, is really inherently inadequate as a solution to the proactive amplification of these harms. And really, more investment in content moderation, which is held up by the company as a solution, it really just leads to a situation of whack-a-mole, where these algorithms are supercharging the spread of harmful content, and then the company is hoping or alleging to catch some of that through content moderation. But we also know from the Facebook papers that the proportion of hate speech being detected by the platform is woefully low, approximately 2%, as we're now aware. So I want to close by emphasizing really the extent to which these harms, the company's active amplification and promotion of harmful content, including incitement to violence against the Rohingya, is baked into the business model of the company. Meta's business model, which is based on the mass collection and monetization of our most intimate personal data, is really the root cause of why these engagement-centric algorithms are prioritized. The more time we spend on the platform, the more engaged we are, the more data we're feeding into this machine, and ultimately the more profitable Meta is becoming, but the more harms that are proliferating as a result. So maybe we can go to the next slide, please, Rebecca. Some of the key conclusions, and I hope we have a chance to delve into some of this further, coming out of this research, is that Meta directly contributed to human rights harms suffered by the Rohingya because it amplified its spread as an active participant, hateful anti-Rohingya hate speech and incitement to violence. We've also found that Meta indirectly contributed to real-world violence by actively promoting the incitement of this violence. And our finding in that regard, I think it's important to point out, is not just that some specific posts led to some sporadic acts of violence. Our finding is that really over a 5-year period, the overall business practices and the influence of these content shaping algorithms help to create an enabling environment for mass violence and help to activate a population in the direction of support for mass violence. And that's a much more substantial finding than just looking at these as isolated incidents, because we need to zoom out and see the overall societal impact of this when there's a really massive transformation in the information landscape and the communications landscape in the way that Meta influenced the landscape in Myanmar. We've also found that Meta repeatedly and extremely failed to engage in adequate human rights due diligence. There's a lack of proactive human rights due diligence around the market entry, lack of ongoing due diligence in response to complaints from outsiders, but also from users. And this all in combination leads to really the inescapable conclusion that Meta did indeed meet the threshold of contribution under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And that threshold is really important, because that is what triggers a responsibility to provide remediation and reparations. And that's why we're now calling on Meta to pay reparations to the Rohingya and supporting the many communities who have been pursuing the company, both through direct requests and through legal cases, because we have found that the company does have a responsibility under international law and standards to pay that remedy. We also find that I think very importantly, under the principle of non-recurrence, in order for Meta to really guarantee that something like this will not happen again in Myanmar or in other sensitive contexts, we really need to see fundamental changes to the business model around the mass surveillance of users and the mass collection of personal data, and also around the use of these algorithms. We need to see much improved transparency, and we need to really reevaluate what user consent looks like. So there's much more I could dive into, but really keen to have enough time for discussion. So I'm going to leave it at that for now. And yeah, okay. Just to say thank you so much to Rebecca for hosting, and thanks to you all again for your time.
Thanks, Pat, and apologies for my screen share issues. I have some kind of glitch in my Zoom, but neither here nor there. I want to say thank you. That is really extensive research that Amnesty has done, and I'm sure that those attending are really happy to hear about this data. And maybe actually, Gloria, if you could pop a link to the report into the chat, that'd be wonderful. If folks want to kind of peruse through that while we're speaking here. But Pat, I think in particular, that final point you made is so important for the investors here in the call who very much adhere to the guiding principles on business and human rights in terms of the way that they formulate their expectations of their companies, and really interesting to see how you've made the case that this threshold of contribution has been reached, which has then those accompanying responsibilities to provide remedies. So maybe also in the discussion, we can talk a little more in terms of your engagement with affected populations, the kind of remedies that they themselves are asking for, which is of course so important to take into account what those who are affected would deem to be adequate remedy and reparation for what they have suffered. But first, I'm going to hand things over to Simon. And Simon, if you want to maybe talk to us a little bit about that investor perspective and tell us a little bit about some upcoming plans in terms of using this wonderful information that Amnesty has provided for those on the call who are interested in engaging with Meta. Over to you, Simon.
I think, and also a big thank you to Pat and folks at Amnesty International.
Simon, I think, is it just, I think you may have some microphone issues. Yeah, okay, Anita's saying she can't hear either yet.
Oh, can nobody hear me?
Yes, now it's going.
Oh,
yes.
Okay, yeah. Well, I just want to, again, thank you, Rebecca, and also an extend thanks to Pat and to Alia at Amnesty International for producing this excellent report, which provides a lot of, I think, actionable information for shareholders of Meta. And I think, just to underscore, I think what we have here is, as Pat has outlined, is, clear evidence of Facebook's significant role in the atrocities perpetrated in Myanmar, particularly against the Rohingya in 2017 and 2018. And underscoring, this is very much baked into Facebook's current business model, with the role of the algorithms and the role of amplification of specific posts that are profitable to Facebook, but constitute hate speech and so forth. And so what we've done is I've put together a kind of a first draft of a public investor statement to Meta based on the information and issues raised in the report. It's focused on the legal risks, reputational risks, and regulatory risks that Facebook is currently facing, but also asks a number of questions on how Facebook is going to make changes to its business model so that these kinds of harms don't occur again. And also raises the question of how Facebook is going to provide remedy to the Rohingya who were harmed by Facebook's conduct. So what I'm hoping that we can get out of this call is I'm looking for a couple of key lead shareholders in Meta who can work with me to finalize this public investor statement to Meta. And then we can circulate that for sign-on by as many folks as possible. But I want to make sure that this letter is very much in an investor voice and highlights the risks to shareholders from Facebook's role in these atrocities, points to the flaws in their business model, and really focuses and leads to a dialogue with Meta that will address all of these risks and all of these harms that arise out of Facebook's current business model. So that's where we are, and I think at this point we'll take as many questions as possible, and definitely get in touch with both Rebecca or myself if you want to play a lead in finalizing the draft of this investor public statement.
Okay, thank you, Simon. And yes, please, maybe, so I think folks have my email on the invitation, but Simon, if it's okay with you, if you could pop your email into the chat function, that'd be great. And people can reach out to us who are interested in having an active role in this investor statement. Also, I just want to, before we open it up for questions, I'm sure folks have a lot of questions. I just want to briefly also, for a number of you, this issue is not new. There are 2 coordinated corporate engagements that we at the Investor Alliance are helping to coordinate with the participation of many of you on the call. One is indeed focused to Myanmar. It was started last year after the coup. We have an investor statement there signed by over 86 investors calling on companies to really map their links to the military junta, looking for possibly any type of business activities or other types of ties that may be play an active role in supporting the military or military affiliated entities. I will pop a link to that in the chat here in 1 second. Meta Facebook has been a target of that, but then also certainly been a target in terms of our digital rights engagement. I'm going to actually ask Anita maybe to say a few sentences to that too before we open it up.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Rebecca. And yeah, I just wanted to speak to the fact that we do have a ICT company and human rights working group. We've been running that for almost 3 years, and in that we engage with various companies, including the big techs, and Meta is a key focus of that issue. We are engaging with them on their use of algorithms, on content moderation, on their business model. So exactly all the points that Pat spoke to are issues that we are engaging with Meta on. There have been some dialogues. We do have a lead. We do have support investors. Anyone who's interested in participating in that, please reach out to me. I also wanted to just highlight that last year there was a proposal filed with Meta as well, basically asking for more board oversight on their content moderation and the resulting sort of the echo chamber, as you said, Pat, of hate speech, disinformation, etc. And that proposal actually secured 63% of the independent vote. That means the shares that are not owned and controlled by Zuckerberg. And so just wanted to sort of emphasize that issue. And then also the issue relating to dual class shares, which impacts the way investors can push companies there. So just calling out that, as we work towards proxy season as well, this is very valuable information for us to continue to develop and engage and push Meta at different platforms. I hope that's helpful. Thanks.
Thanks, Nia. That's very helpful indeed. And I see already that there's some folks putting questions in the chat, so we'll open things up. I'll ask the question here from Gayatri in a second, but just wanted to say if folks have questions, again, you can either place it in the chat or use the reactions function to raise your hand, and then please also introduce yourselves when you do speak. And Gayatri is with the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, a colleague of theirs there, and she asked Patrick, could you speak to what the response of Meta has been to this report and the findings, if any?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Gaia, and thanks, Rebecca. So we engaged with Meta very actively throughout this process. Early on in the process, we asked research questions. We asked for information about the extent to which the company engaged in human rights due diligence ahead of 2017, and its own awareness of the extent of the harms associated with its algorithms, among many other questions. Again, later on, once we had finalized our draft report, we also provided all of our key allegations and evidence to the company and provided them with an opportunity to respond on the substance. So we got a response to the first letter, and in it, Meta gave some information stating that they had improved significantly since 2017, and they reference major investments in Myanmar, as they often have done. Myanmar, I guess, has been a kind of a probably the most scrutinized market in the world for Meta because of what happened, and they certainly have invested a lot there in terms of content moderation. But they also declined to comment on anything to do with their operations prior to 2017. And they cited the fact that these issues are the subject of ongoing litigation. Similarly, when we sent our allegations, we didn't receive any substantive response, with Meta citing the fact that these issues were the subject of ongoing litigation. So just to add, I mean, in case there's not broad awareness, there are kind of 3 active cases ongoing in relation to these issues. Civil cases seeking damages in the UK and the US of $150 billion US. And there's also an OECD process underway where communities have asked for $1 million in support to fund educational initiatives in Cox's Bazar. But because Meta has refused that request, it is now the subject of an OECD complaint being considered by the US National Contact Point. I guess I would add a little to in terms of their response in relation to their investments in Myanmar. I think these things are important. We've definitely seen an improvement in terms of community engagement in Myanmar. There are better relationships with activists, for example, and we've also seen better content moderation. So Meta has banned certain actors, for example, from the platform now in more recent years. But our view on this is that it's doomed to fail as a response. Content moderation being the key mitigation measure will never work, because it's really failing to get to the root cause of these issues of algorithmic amplification of hate speech, which is at the core of the business model. And I think this is, you know, something key for us to recall.
Thanks,
Thanks
Pat.
for
And
that.
I see that Danny Raymond, Guy's colleague at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, also has said that there's been a response provided. Danny, did you want to quickly speak to that?
Yes, of course, thank you. So we have been following the report from Amnesty International, also to add that in our site. And so we were also following if Meta provide any response to see if we will then look for any response by ourselves. But we saw that they respond in this article to the report, like just providing a statement, right? So that is what I just mentioned, and you can see in this publication that Meta says basically says certain words regarding to the activity that they have and the engagement that they're having with the Rohingya people, but nothing else, and not more in depth regarding to the allegations in the report, right? So that's what I can add. So thanks, and Patrick, it's a great job. So thank you for sharing this.
Thanks, Danny. And then Sam, I'm sorry, I'm not calling on people. Do you want to just go ahead and ask your question of Pat and Sam directly? Sam, if not, if you don't want to go off mute, that's fine. I can also ask.
No, that's fine, Rebecca. I mean, we've done, you know, a lot of support, provide a lot of support on different company engagements across tech sector or across sectors, tech and otherwise, but we have not worked in depth on social media platforms. And so I'm just wondering, from sort of a conflict affected lens, if Patrick has any recommendations about, within a heightened human rights due diligence process and based on Meta's business model, what would be some of the highlighted components that really need the most work?
Yeah, thanks so much for that brilliant question. We have touched upon this extensively in the report, and you know, it's been a challenge at times, because it's an ever evolving sector, and these technologies change rapidly, and international standards are constantly trying to keep up. But I would add to that, you know, that the fundamental principle that companies have responsibilities to engage in proactive due diligence based on their business operations, that principle was certainly in force at the time of Meta's engagement in Myanmar. But we now have the benefit of more detailed guidance from certain international sources, including recent reports by the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, and also the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, among others, who have specifically addressed the issue of tech companies and related harms, disinformation, and hate speech in conflict-affected settings. And very recently, just in the past week or two, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression has a new one that's a new report specifically devoted to conflict-affected settings in respect of these issues. So there are standards there. But an example of the basic calls that we're making, and which are reflected in these international standards, when it comes to the use of artificial intelligence and algorithms are that, you know, there has to be a human rights due diligence process that is created around the creation of these systems and that can effectively monitor their impact and implementation. Because really what we're seeing right now is the rapid development of new technologies and their shipping to market in order to maximize profits, and then those which are successful at increasing engagement and profits are maintained. But the reality of what we've seen in terms of Facebook's business practices or Meta's business practices has been there's been no such processes. Now we've also seen claims since the Haugen disclosures that Meta intends to put safety up front, but we really haven't seen any transparency around this. So, you know, we remain, I guess, skeptical as to the extent to which this is really applying international standards. But I'd be happy to follow up and share some of those reports if that would be helpful.
That would be great. Thanks so much, Patrick.
And Simon, I was just going to look to you to see if you wanted to jump in as well, but I also noticed that Margaret Wachenfeld is on the line, and I know Margaret was deeply involved in recently released OHCHR report, which is the follow-up to the International Independent Fact Findings Mission to Myanmar. And Margaret, I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but I did notice you're on the call. Did you maybe want to say a point or two about that report? All right, quite all right. I'm putting folks on the spotlight here. Simon, go ahead. Did you want to comment as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you know, this discussion kind of really underscores, you know, how much Meta needs to be engaged by investors on how they're going to apply human rights due diligence, not just on after the fact on content moderation, but on how they're building their whole business model and how they deploy their algorithms. So, you know, I see this investor statement as being an opportunity to spark off exactly that kind of investor engagement of Meta, and again building on this report and also the disclosures by Frances Haugen. So yeah, and I think, you know, this kind of goes to Michael Connor's point in the comments is I don't think there's been this kind of very, very targeted and keen engagement of Meta's top management by investors on this, and this is an excellent opportunity to really jumpstart that dialogue and make sure that the investor voice is heard on these issues.
If I might add to that, Simon, in response to Michael's question about what level of management at Meta we've managed to engage with. So Meta now has a human rights team, and this relationship or our communication is managed by that team, and they have been the ones responsible for responding to our concerns and allegations, and you know, there has been, I guess, the head of that team is Miranda Sissons, and there's been engagement from her in response to our work, but we don't have any sense yet as to how far beyond the human rights team, you know, some of these concerns have traveled. But yes, of course, we're always hopeful that our work will reach those most influential individuals, and you know, hopefully there's a role that you all can play in assisting, you know, that result.
Mike, I saw you went off mic there. Did you have a follow-up point you wanted to make?
Just an observation about how scandalous this company is. You know, we investors and others accuse many tech companies of doing some very terrible things, but thousands of people have died, and the senior management of the company has failed to engage on this issue. It's just off the charts crazy. That's all.
Hear you on that. And I just, before I hand it over to Anita, who wants to make a comment, I also just wanted to point out that Ben Chikroon from Candrium also noted that There is certainly apparently increased scrutiny right now by investors of their business model, and also noting that Meta stock is down 65% from a 2021 high. It has lost 600+ billion in market capitalization. So it seems to be having some impact, the bad behavior, one would hope. Anita, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to sort of echo, just contributing to the question that Michael raised. Pat's response as well. I mean, investors have been really trying to engage with Meta. The dialogue is very much with the human rights team. And so, you know, piercing beyond that veil, and in a sense, you know, their human rights team that they've hired includes a lot of folks from civil society as well. And so they kind of speak the same language. And to some extent, we have great conversations, but we don't really see that sort of piercing beyond that level to management, to actual sort of significant changes. I mean, we do see some changes. So there is that, you know, they have created that buffer in terms of us able to actually reach management. And, you know, when we have conversations, we want the person who is a decision maker on this particular issue to be on the call. But I think it still seems to get sort of stuck there. So just wanted to raise that. And if anybody had any suggestions on, you know, how to pierce that veil, so to speak, you know, happy to hear your thoughts on it. But Meta does engage in a fair amount of conversation with investors on different issues.
Thank you, Anita. My firsthand experience. Yeah, Simon, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, building on Anita's point, I think it's a really good one. I mean, it sounds like both NGOs and investors are running up against this buffer, and it's like this ceiling that we need to break through. And so, you know, I think this kind of public investor letter would be very valuable. I think it's important. I think it's important for the letter to be public, based on the fact that Meta has not been responsive thus far to both NGO and investor scrutiny of their business practices. And you know, I think after the publication of this letter, I think it would be useful to you know, use that to request a dialogue with Meta that includes not just people in their human rights team, that includes people from their business team, and also, you know, I think that you know, from the letter and also from the recent Facebook report, there might be some opportunity here to refile last year's resolution with some updated language, and that would be a way of, you know, reaching beyond the human rights team and directly engaging the board and top management. So I throw that out as an idea. But I think, you know, first we need to get this public investor letter finished, and again, I'm looking forward to working with folks on that.
Thanks, Simon. It looks like Jeff Perkins from Friends Fiduciary seconding that thought, saying that to get through that ceiling at Meta, it seems escalation might be in order, whether it was in terms of resolutions or focus on the board of directors. And also just want to note that Margaret Wachenfeld put the link to the OHCHR's report, the follow-up report to the independent fact-finding missions report there in the chat function as well.
If I can just add, Rebecca.
Yeah, please, Margaret, go ahead.
Sorry, I was literally walked out of the room at the wrong time.
Put you on the spot.
No, and indeed, this report does not address Meta. I mean, it addresses other military connections with business, but it doesn't address the Meta issue. That's not to say that it's absolutely not relevant. And there are many other things that investors can do coming out of the new report, but that's a subject of another discussion that we're going to have. I do wonder, and Simon, I'm sure you've already done this, right, of highlighting this to a lot of the ESG rating agencies, right, making sure these kind of public letters get under their noses so they're picking it up. I'm assuming that other people on the call just talking about Myanmar and ESG rating agencies have seen the report from Inclusive Development International. I'm sure you flagged that, Rebecca, in the past about whether ESG rating agencies are picking up these kinds of issues.
I mean, Margaret, that's a very good point. You know, this past year, this past shareholder season has been primarily focused on Chevron because they are such a significant provider of cash to the military. That resolution came to a vote, got 12%, which was a big increase on previous years. And that was a resolution that raised Myanmar in the context of asking Chevron to adopt a policy of not doing business with governments engaged in genocide or crimes against humanity. There was we put together a very good exempt solicitation, which laid out the issues and also made recommendations to Chevron on how they could responsibly disengage from Myanmar, with the focus on putting any money, which under the contract is you know, share of revenues to the government, putting that money in escrow and sending to international arbitration the issue of who actually represents the government of Myanmar at this point. So, you know, I don't know the extent to which that resolution and that exempt solicitation, though public, have factored into the ESG ratings of Chevron and other companies in Burma. But I think, you know, again, moving forward, I think that's a very good way to continue to put pressure on the company around these issues. And it's definitely something that we should move forward on for this coming shareholder season.
Thanks, Simon. And I just actually put it in the chat a link to that Inclusive Development International report. If I may, I will take the prerogative for a moment to ask Pat a question, because I'm very curious, you know, if you have a sense to what extent Meta has engaged with some of the impacted Rohingya communities. I think it was in a brief to the report, there was a mention that Meta said that they don't see themselves as responsible for providing, you know, philanthropy to those communities, but obviously, at least from Amnesty's finding, it goes beyond philanthropy and really is a matter about making good the harms to which they contributed. Just curious if you've had that engagement, and if Meta's had that engagement with the affected communities, if Amnesty has the kind of asks that those communities are making of Meta, and if there's any precedent for communities successfully receiving that type of remuneration, be it through, you know, just negotiated settlements or be it through legal cases.
Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, so we've been working very closely with quite a few of the affected communities, mostly those who still reside in Cox's Bazar refugee camps. And yeah, we've also documented in the report the multi-year interactions that some of those community and their representatives have had with Meta. And as I mentioned, I mean, the most prominent manifestation of that has been the community's request for Meta to contribute just $1 million, which it's worth mentioning is something like 0.0006% of its annual profits into an educational project in the camps. And it's also worth mentioning that, you know, educational provision in the camps is really, really dire, and most kids are really, you know, wasting their youth without much hope for a brighter future because of the lack of educational provision. The UN has estimated just 1.6% of educational funding needs are actually currently met in the camps. So it shows the urgency of this from a, you know, material perspective, as well as the principled case for reparations. But there has been engagement. Meta has met with them, I believe, you know, as high as Miranda Sisson's involvement herself was on a call with some of their community representatives. But while we've seen a willingness to meet that's kind of where the engagement has ended. When this $1 million request came in, as you noted, Facebook said it does not engage in philanthropic activities, and that was really the trigger for the communities and their representatives to engage in this OECD-led process. So there seems to be a real reluctance to pay for the harms. You know, of course, there's a financial cost to it. Arguably, there's a concern about precedent there, but that's speculation on my part. And really, no, there's no precedent that I'm aware of or that we're aware of tech companies paying out for harms in this way. But we're beginning to enter a new era of tech accountability, and it's really worth bearing this in mind, including from an investor perspective, because there's real risks coming through certain legal cases and through imminent and proposed legislation in key jurisdictions, in which is facilitating, you know, tech companies to be held increasingly accountable. But while we haven't seen actually substantial remediation happen from tech companies for similar harms in the past, this is an incredibly strong case. And, you know, some of these cases I mentioned have not been heard on their merits yet. So they're still in the early stages. And as some of you may know, there's big major cases coming up in the US Supreme Court around Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, where the Supreme Court is going to re-examine the question of tech companies' immunity from being held liable for third-party content on their platforms. And they're going to specifically ask the question as to whether this immunity should extend to the algorithmic amplification of third-party content. So we could be on the cusp of a new era of accountability, and that's, you know, it's a major risk for Meta, especially because it has been refusing to engage with remediation on the terms the community requires today.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. And I like that. That's a good kind of closing note to leave things on. We're on the cusp of a new era of accountability for the tech sector. So I think that's very a positive note to leave things on. Obviously, there's much work to still be done, and I think the research that Amnesty has provided will be very useful for investors as they engage with Meta and other tech sector companies. So we are actually at time. So, you know, round of applause. Thank you to Pat and to Simon for joining us today. And thanks to all of you for listening and asking the excellent questions. And please, as Simon has said, be in touch with us if you would like to become involved in this investor statement. And yeah, we'll look forward to staying in touch moving forward. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.